So after Elemental Mastery being a bait on here and here, I thought it's time to redeem itself for sure on Venti. Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to continue exploring Elemental Mastery, and this time on our favorite character Venti, just to get disappointing results again, of course. Now, before we dive into any math, I actually want to talk about his elemental skill very quickly. His elemental skill, Skyra Sona, have a really high scaling, surprisingly, when you press it or even when you hold it. Here I have it level 6 and this has about 400% scaling. So just judging from this number, you can already tell that Elemental Mastery is completely worthless on his elemental skill. So to visualize this, taking a look at my example right here, I have no artifact equipped except for the feather, which is of course providing me 300 attack each and not changeable again. And I'm also equipping a level 80 stringless just like last time, and in total I have approximately 1000 attack. So what's 1000 attack on my level 6 Skyward Sona, right? It does approximately like 3800 damage, or around up to 4000 damage on it base, not counting any of the stat that we potentially looking for in our artifact like crit rate, anemo damage, or even elemental mastery. In contrast, when I use my E ability on an enemy and it swerve, it only does 500 damage. So in order to us to even beat the base damage just using elemental mastery, we need our swerve to do approximately 8 times the damage before it can be comparable to the base damage on our E. That's just straight up impossible because elemental mastery is capped, and so you never go elemental mastery if you're looking for E damage. Now, I know a lot of you are interested in his burst ability instead, where he has very low scaling. Here I'm at level 8 on his elemental burst talent, and it only has 60% dot scaling with a 30% additional elemental damage. So maybe you're wondering, hey, for his burst, elemental mastery might be better, and let's take a look. Okay, let's pause here for a second because there's a lot of number on the screen. Starting off with the 339 of the animal damage, that is the elemental burst dot damage from the Venti, with the 575 one right here being the critical one of that. And now the 927 pyro damage is actually quite interesting. Starting off with this guy right here. So this guy is the original guy that we shot our amber arrows on, and he's the person who was first inflicted with the pyro debuff status. And now he's being swerved by the Venti elemental burst, and so he took 927 pyro damage from the swerve effect. And then moving on to the person next to him, you can see that he is now infected with pyro because the pyro was swerved from the person next to him onto him, and he also took 927 pyro damage. Now what's important to note is that this is not a swerve damage, and instead it is a spread damage. I'll explain this in more detail in a bit. And then the Venti elemental burst has been transformed into a power element, denoted by the red color on the elemental burst of Venti's. Here you can see that the original dot damage from the Venti still exists, which is the 500 number. However, there's an additional damage now, which is this 169 pyro damage. This damage is additional from the elemental burst of Venti, and take Venti's stat into a coordination of the calculation, except for the anemo damage because it's not an anemo damage, and it's a pyro number. And let's rewind a bit. Remember when I said there's a difference between swerve and spread? So here you can see that every single enemy actually have 2 511 number on them, and remember this is from the pyro swerve, and so why are they taking twice the damage? The reason of that is because both themselves and their neighbors are infected with pyro element, and so when you get swerved, first of all you take the swerve damage, and then you spread the pyro damage onto your neighbor, and for your neighbor he'll do the same. He'll take a swerve damage and then he'll spread that pyro neighbor onto you. So in total, not only you take one swerve damage, but you also take a spread damage, and that's why you see 2511 pyro damage number here. This is actually a unique property of swerve, and you can see it a bit more clearly here where they all take 2 instances of damage. And finally, as always, your elemental burst is self-scaled with all the stats here, including critical rate, critical damage, and your anemo damage bonus, except for the transformation part. And your swerve only scale with your elemental mastery. So pretty much for our damage today, we have something like this. Something worthy of taking note here is that the swerve damage here is multiplied by 2 because it applied twice as we explained it. And finally, the transformation damage do not take into amino damage multiplier as a coordination. So with all of those, we once again turn to our program that we created last time to brute force the solution of the most damage. Quickly call out for those who care about the code. The last time I used recursion to generate the subset, but I optimized it a significant amount by using a combinatorics method, SAR and SPAR, to generate possible combination of substat instead. This makes the program run significantly faster, although I could use a catch, but I'm too lazy to make one. And once again, to nobody's surprise, it trashed Elemental Mastery and instead just the traditional crit and critical damage, attack, and the enemy will have allocation. Aside from making it faster, I also made it output a graph so we can see what's going on. Now, at first, this graph may look a bit bizarre, but let's dive into it and see. Starting off with the x-axis, we have the number of Elemental Mastery allocated, meaning that how much of our artifact went into Elemental Mastery versus comparatively to other stats such as attack or critical rate. And on the y-axis, we have the number of damage we would be expecting to do using this build. Now, starting off with the very left, this is the minimum number of Elemental Mastery, which is 115 since we have 5 artifacts explained it before. Now you might be confused, like why is there a dramatic difference between the lower bound and upper bound? Here the lower bound it's the 4,000 value-ish and the upper bound is close to 6,000. The reason of this is because these are your other artifact allocation. For example, if you put everything into critical damage, doesn't consider like balancing the attack percentile or the critical rate out, then you might get a very bad number, and so that is the lower bound here on the 4,000. In comparison, if you perfectly allocate everything evenly, then you can get the upper bound of close to 5,700 or like something like that. And the first observation we can immediately see is that following the red trend line, we're assuming we perfectly allocate every single thing. The more we trade off for Elemental Mastery, the worse our damage become. So meaning that like, oh, instead of doing attack, we start sacrificing our attack for Elemental Mastery, assuming optimal for every stage. Our damage will start slowly decreasing. However, something to take note here is that if your artifact are bad allocated, for example, you don't have enough critical rate, it might actually be better to stack EM, as you can see that for our worst case scenario, the trend's actually a upward trend all the way until our equilibrium at the very end. This is represented with the orange line at the bottom. Now that pretty much means that Elemental Mastery is not the end of the world. It's okay if you're only using him for his elemental burst, except when you consider these problems. Problem number 1, stringless exists. The stringless passive is way too strong for you not to build attack or that stat that you can utilize it. Not to mention that it already provides some elemental mastery, meaning that you probably don't want to stack more elemental mastery. And when we factor in stringless, this is the damage graph. As you can see, a very clear downward trend. The second problem is that Venti E have way too high scaling, as we have mentioned at the very beginning of the video. Now, you might think that Venti's elemental burst can hit way more enemy than Venti's E can, so therefore the damage shouldn't be able to be compared like that. But in reality, if you just cast E during his elemental burst, it pretty much guarantees you to hit all the enemies, so the number of enemy counts is not really a problem. And when we just count that one single E in, this is what happened. It's a complete downward trend as you trade your stat for elemental mastery. So yeah, not really worth. The ultimate conclusion is that if you're just throwing his burst, then it's okay to build elemental mastery if you have like nothing else better, but in every other scenario, it just like completely outclassed it by the normal traditional stat. So yeah, that's it for this video. I'm curious if there's anything elemental mastery is actually good at. Well, but anyway, see you guys next time.